So you support articles of impeachment being brought. Would you vote for impeachment?
Look, I'm still a member of the public, and I don't have the access to the investigative abilities of the Congress. I'm here in Helena, Montana. So I would say right now, what's occurring is deeply disturbing. There are not only allegations, they're admitted to things that have occurred that have never been done in any other presidency. And we're in truly uncharted waters here. So, of course, I have my own opinion personally, but I'm not in the Congress yet. So if anything, know that I believe in a co-equal branch of government for the Congress, and that as a congressman, I'm going to fight not only for that elected body, but for Montanans. So this issue is just something we have to keep bringing up and ensure that there are actual investigations done.
So impeachment aside, Montana has one at-large congressperson.
Mm-hmm.
As one member of a body of 435, how can you best represent Montana? What can you do for Montana as a junior member in a large body with only one representative? What are your priorities?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think it's really important sometimes, and Montanans have this often, if you ever go outside of the state, we're the lonely voice arguing for our values and the way of life we have here. And so there's many different places we can go with this. I'm so concerned about what's happening in healthcare. And that's what got me involved in public service in the first place. And it's what makes me want to do this as well. We cannot lose our rural hospitals. I mean, Phillipsburg, Superior, to name a few around Missoula, the hospital in Havre, we cannot lose our critical access in rural hospitals. And there are monumental changes coming to healthcare, whether we like it or not. And that has nothing to do with politics. We must change because people cannot be continuing to go into excessive medical debt just because they broke their leg. But more importantly, in the Montana context, you can't have people dying on their way to the hospital because we lost the hospital in Havre and you got to drive them down to Great Falls. That just can't happen, not in the 21st century in the richest country on earth. And I foresee that happening if we don't have major changes to what occurs, especially with our rural area hospitals. And so I want to be a champion in the coming changes in healthcare. And this is going to be a multi-year process. But we need to have a champion for rural and underserved communities and make sure that they are involved in the healthcare decisions coming up. So I think that's the thing that we can do in the Congress specifically, because there's just so few people who represent these big rural states. And we have a specific concern here about a strong healthcare system that really does serve rural areas.
As a member of Congress, you're a federal lawmaker, right? So you go from being a member of the legislative branch here in Montana, where you're making state law, to the federal branch, where you're making federal law. What other federal laws would you like to address? Do you have bills that you plan to bring right out of the gate? Do you have committees that you are especially excited to serve on? What are your federal priorities?
In
addition to healthcare.
Sure, of course. So like you said, too, one of 435 people, right? You need to be the best voice you can for your constituents. And in my case, you have to leverage what Montana has as well. And this is where I'm about to talk about public lands, everybody. So remember that anytime anyone who wants to be elected in Montana starts talking about public lands, make sure they're actually saying something and not just, paying lip service to this idea of what we have. We need to protect our public lands. Montana's congressional delegation 50 years ago gave the country the Wilderness Act. Now, we can quibble about what wilderness means to us now, but I don't think any Montanan is going to disagree that that's a landmark piece of legislation. That came from a Montanan's understanding of what it meant to be in wild places and to conserve our public lands. Now, ever since then, I'd say that we haven't had much good representation in our Congress that really brings what we've learned living amongst wild places to the Congress and to the federal level. So it's so important, especially for being the only congressperson from Montana, to be talking about what it's like to live with wild places and with public lands and how to defend them. And so that includes building an economy like ours around those issues, like we've done already. We see parts of our state thriving because of their location and access to public lands. We need to acknowledge that in the federal law and move it forward. And that includes reauthorizing the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That includes fighting back against people who want to cut off your access to your public lands. And that's one that's so important because you can use Montana as a bully pulpit. Because the guy from Connecticut, he doesn't get what it's like to live near the Pintlers. He doesn't know what it's like to have access to the public lands outside your door cut off by some rich guy from Texas buying up a ranch around it. But you do, and I do. And so what I'm going to do is fight for that in Congress. But beyond that, I mean, we can talk about a host of issues. I mean, every day it seems like the world's on fire. You were talking about that before. We're recording this early. We don't know what's going to happen in a week. But I am so concerned about losing our rural hospitals. But I'm also concerned about people going into bankruptcy to pay for healthcare. We need to look at having everyone get healthcare. And I'm talking about healthcare for all. And that's a conversation we need to have as Montanans and as a country, because it's not right in the richest country on earth to see people going without their insulin because they can't afford it when they could drive north to Canada and pay $4 for it.
So healthcare for all, Medicare for all, that's something that's been talked about a lot on the presidential campaign. So are you in support of a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren style healthcare for all plan, or do you support more of the more conservative approach that Vice President Biden has offered? Where do you fall on the federal healthcare, how we're going to pay for it and who's going to get it and whether or not it's going to raise taxes? I mean,
Sure. So this is a massive issue. This is a sixth of our economy we're talking about here. So first off, my biggest concern as a legislator is healthcare and access to healthcare. Watching what's happened with my family and with someone with a chronic illness and what it did to our finances, what it did to her prospects in life, what it meant for the ways that people struggle through what happens to everybody, pre-existing conditions, having children born prematurely. None of these things should mean that you go bankrupt. But in the wealthiest country on earth and the only developed country on earth without healthcare for everybody, we need to look at changing it. And so when I talk about this, everyone says, oh, do you mean the Bernie plan? Do you mean the Sanders? Look, I'm not running for president. Here's what I know. We need healthcare for all. And that means that we need to have a healthcare law that guarantees healthcare as a right, that does not tax the middle class again for something that we could just remove corporate bailouts and continue to give people what they deserve, which is healthcare. And then finally, we've had people fighting this fight for a long time, for decades, specifically unions. The things that they've worked for, the insurance carve-outs that they've spent decades and lifetimes arguing for, those also need to be protected. So, people say, which one do you prefer? I'm not running for president. I can't make this happen overnight, and truly neither can the president. But I am going to fight every day to ensure that everyone has access to health care. And that's quality health care, and that's health care they can afford. And if that's universal health care, if that's Medicare for all, I want it to happen. Just as long as we don't tax the middle class or get rid of the healthcare gains that we've seen people get through their employer or through their union.
So I imagine the three major issues that we hear talked about more than anything else are healthcare, jobs, taxes, and then you throw in public lands and climate change. Some prioritize some of those above others. I want to talk about public lands as it relates to jobs. You talked about building up economies around public lands and access to public lands. And, I think what you're referring to is the recreation economy that sprouts up around wilderness areas, rivers, fishing, national parks, that sort of thing. We've been doing a lot of economic reporting here at the Montana Free Press. And one of the things that's pretty obvious is that a lot of the jobs that are associated with that type of economy are service-oriented jobs that are relatively low paying. They don't come with the kinds of benefits that the more traditional manufacturing and blue collar jobs that were associated with logging, mining, oil and gas development, that sort of thing. So how do you build up an economy that supports good, high paying jobs that the middle class can survive on, that have insurance, that have benefits, that have retirement plans, that replace those jobs that we're seeing being lost as the sort of extractive economy diminishes? I
think you've truly asked the big question here, because what you're saying about the new service-oriented jobs that don't just come in places in economies that are transitioning to a recreation economy like Montana is, but everywhere else too. You've seen the rise of service industry jobs and the decline of manufacturing jobs across the nation. And now service industry jobs are the largest proportion of our economy at this point. And yet, the benefits that our employers provide, the workplace protection laws have not kept up. And so we've seen a 40-year wage stagnation for people. Middle-class people have not had a raise for 40 years. And also they've lost their jobs, been forced to work at Walmart or forced to work at a coffee shop. Everyone is now on their own when before they weren't. And so when I'm talking about fighting for public lands, when I'm talking about healthcare for all, when I'm talking about any of these issues, these are all in service of trying to right this fundamental wrong about what's happened since before I was born. Now, I can take this even larger. As someone who's 33, I have a lot of friends who are still paying off not medical debt also, but paying off student debt. I mean, tell me why it's fair that my generation is the only one that graduates with a mortgage and then has to have a second mortgage also to buy a home or to start a business. You talk about why millennials, which I guess I'm one of them, why we don't invest in our communities. It's because we're already paying student debt. So when we're talking about how we build an economy, I think what you're asking partly is that it works for everybody. I find that to be such a hazy phrase. How do we change our laws so that they benefit people who work for a living, which is the vast majority of Americans, rather than have laws that help the people who already have cash? I just simply don't understand how we have a government that works for those people who've already done so well by either being born into it or by being incredibly intelligent and working their way to the top. So when you say you're concerned about service jobs replacing, say, a factory job or a job in a mill, believe me, that is why I'm talking about healthcare for all. Because if everyone was making $75,000 a year, I don't think I'd hear from as many of my constituents concerned about whether they can afford a $4,000 deductible. But that's not the case. I mean, our minimum wage remains under $8. Does anyone think that that's a true living wage? I know no one does. And for politicians and for people who are in policy to act as if this is just something we put up with, this is new. This is a new problem, and we need to address it.
You've got a lot of ideas about how to solve a lot of the big problems facing Montana, facing the country. How do you convince the rural voter out in, central or eastern Montana who grew up on a ranch, grew up on a farm, may want to inherit that ranch without having to pay the quote unquote death tax, otherwise referred to as the inheritance tax? How does a Democrat from Missoula appeal to a rural voter in Montana and convince them that it's one thing to go around and talk to people in your district in Missoula, but it's another thing to be able to represent the diverse voices from throughout Montana? How do you go about doing that?
Well, of course. I mean, the thing is too, it's, Missoula's not all like hippies walking around in huaraches. Like, my district voted for President Trump plus 11. It was held by a Republican previously. My constituents currently are majority Republican. I do, and not to quibble with the questioner here, but this idea of rural versus urban, to call a small town in Montana urban is a stretch anyway, Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus liberal, the only people this serves are the people who already have the power. And I don't think it's going very well under their current administration in any way. And so whether or not I can speak to someone in Glendive, tell me why, as an elected representative, I shouldn't have my first priority be the single parent working at the gas station in Glendive. Tell me why I shouldn't be orienting every aspect of my campaign, but also any policy I bring forward to ensuring that people who are working extremely hard for their families and for themselves in places where it's difficult to do so aren't going to do better. And so when you say like the family farmer who wants to inherit the place and is concerned about so-called death tax, you haven't heard me say that I want to continue the death tax for farms. You haven't heard me say that I think that any aspect of any policy should ever be hurting people who work for a living. I just don't believe it. And I really do think it's a false dichotomy to say that someone from Missoula, air quotes, or from any town in Montana can't adequately represent anywhere else. I mean, for the opposite idea, I quibble very much so with Representative Gianforte's policies and his governing style and his ability to physically attack reporters. Now, does anyone think that because he is a extremely successful tech businessman from Bozeman that he can't speak to people in Glendive? The question is never posed to him. So what I think you're really asking is this a question, can Democrats talk to people like that? And I can tell you right now, the younger generation can, because we are tired of not only losing, but we're tired of losing this country to people who work only for themselves and who only help people who don't work for a living. Because I see every day how difficult it is to make a life here. And I want to make sure that I'm serving my friends and my community, my family, everybody here as much as possible by making sure federal policy is oriented to people who work and who are trying to make healthy families and healthy lives in a place that I know we all love.
Well, Representative Tom Winter, thanks so much for coming by today. I enjoyed talking to you, and good luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you. This was fun.
And thanks to all of you, the listeners of the Montana Lowdown podcast. The Montana Lowdown is a production of Montana Free Press, an independent nonprofit news organization supported by readers and listeners like you. You can learn more about the people and topics featured on the Lowdown by visiting montanafreepress.org. And if you enjoyed our podcast, please consider rating us in the iTunes store. Those ratings help us move up in the listings so we can reach more people who care about these issues. Our show was produced by Alex McKenzie. Our theme song was composed and performed by Montana artist Dan Dubuque and was recorded by 408 Productions. I'm Montana Free Press founder and editor John Adams. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for our next conversation on the Montana Lowdown podcast.